Raja Mahendra Pratap, the Rebel Prince of India. Part 1. The Birth of a Rebel Prince. The winter sun of December 1st, 1886, rose quietly over the princely state of Mersin in Uttar Pradesh. The day was ordinary for most, yet it carried with it the birth of a child destined to stir extraordinary storms in the heart of an enslaved nation. That morning, Raja Ghanshyam Singh's household welcomed his third son, a boy whose fate would diverge far from the sheltered halls of royalty into the tumultuous battleground of revolution. They named him Mahendra Pratap. Though born into privilege, his life was never to be defined by luxury. Fortune, it seemed, was eager to thrust him onto a different stage. At the tender age of 3, he was adopted by Raja Harnarayan Singh of Hathras, a powerful figure who had no heir of his own. Adoption in princely families was not uncommon, but this act of providence was significant. It gave the boy not just the name and title of a prince, but also the responsibility to carry forward a legacy. To many, he was a child of fortune, yet beneath his innocent smile, a restless fire had already been kindled. His early days were steeped in the culture of kingship, grand durbars, silken halls, and the weight of tradition pressing upon his young shoulders. Yet, the young Mahendra's eyes would often wander beyond the walls of his palace. While elders spoke of diplomacy and inheritance, he gazed toward the commoners in the streets, farmers toiling under the merciless sun, artisans carving beauty into wood and stone, men and women carrying burdens heavier than their bodies could bear. Even as a boy, he felt a strange kinship with them. Perhaps it was fate whispering to him that his destiny was tied not with thrones, but with those who bent under colonial chains. When he was still little more than a boy, marriage came to him as it often did in princely houses, early, ceremonial, and binding. In 1902, while still pursuing his education, Mahendra was wed to Balveer Kaur, a young woman from the princely state of Haryana, then part of Punjab. For most, this union would have been a moment to settle into tradition, but for Mahendra it was merely another step in life's unfolding journey. He was a dutiful husband, yet his heart never ceased to beat for something larger for an India yet unborn, free from foreign shackles. But before destiny would unveil its grand design, education called him. In 1895, his family admitted him to the government high school in Aligarh. It was a British-run institution, a place where the empire subtly crafted loyal subjects. But soon after, his course shifted to a place that would forever shape his outlook: the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental Collegiate School, later known as Aligarh Muslim University. Founded by the visionary Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, this institution carried with it the pulse of reform, dialogue, and the meeting of cultures. Here, young Mahendra studied under British headmasters and Muslim teachers, exposed to the clash of world's imperial authority on one hand and the rising intellectual ferment of India on the other. In Aligarh, his mind grew restless with questions. He read history not as a mere collection of dates, but as a saga of human struggle, of empires that rose and fell, of nations that fought and bled for their freedom. Surrounded by fellow students from across the land, he saw the diversity of India, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Christian youths bound by the same yearning for dignity. Something stirred within him, a seed of rebellion, small but unshakable. Yet, for all the privileges of his royal birth, Mahendra's path was never going to be that of a silent prince. Even in his adolescence, he felt drawn not toward the velvet thrones of power, but toward the fiery speeches of reformers and rebels. He saw the duplicity of the British, their polished manners cloaking the machinery of exploitation. The empire presented itself as a guardian of civilization, yet every village in India testified to its hunger for wealth and control. Young Mahendra could not ignore it. His princely tutors told him loyalty to the Raj was wise. His conscience whispered otherwise. His family, especially his father-in-law, often feared his leanings. They wanted him to embody the dignity of royalty, to inherit tradition, to keep away from politics. But Mahendra was not fashioned to be a passive custodian of titles. His restless spirit found inspiration in the unfolding Swadeshi movement, that cry for indigenous industries and self-reliance. The call to boycott foreign goods and uplift India's artisans resonated deeply with him. To him, it was not merely economics, it was dignity. A nation that could not clothe itself or feed itself could never truly call itself free. In 1906, against the advice of his family, he traveled to Calcutta, then the capital of British India, to attend the Indian National Congress session. The journey was more than physical, it was a spiritual awakening. There he met men and women who would become the architects of freedom, fiery speakers, dreamers, and rebels who envisioned a free India. Their passion electrified him. In those crowded halls, amidst slogans and debates, he felt as though he had found his true home. This was not merely a gathering of politicians. It was the heartbeat of a nation awakening from centuries of slumber. That moment, the young Prince of Mersin ceased to be merely Mahendra. He became something greater, a man who pledged his life not to crowns and jewels, but to the sacred cause of liberty. He returned from Calcutta with a new fire in his veins. He spoke often of self-reliance, of nurturing local artisans, of industries free from foreign chains. His words carried conviction, but they unsettled his aristocratic kin. They feared he was drifting too far from the safety of royalty. But Mahendra knew the truth. His destiny was no longer bound by palace walls. In the years that followed, his journey would take him far beyond borders, into conspiracies, revolutions, and even the halls of international diplomacy. But those seeds of rebellion were planted in these early years, in the streets of Aligarh, in the Congress halls of Calcutta, in the quiet observation of his people's suffering. The boy, born a prince, had chosen to be something else entirely. A servant of his people, a warrior against empire, a dreamer of freedom. And thus began the saga of Raja Mahendra Pratap, the rebel prince of India. Part 2. The Forge of Ideas. The corridors of Aligarh were alive with whispers of reform, debate, and dissent. For Mahendra Pratap, these were not just academic years. They were the years when the fire within him was sharpened into resolve. His education was meant to shape him into a polished prince, fluent in English, conversant in etiquette, and deferential to the empire. Yet the very institutions designed to tame his spirit ended up strengthening his rebellion. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, with its blend of British discipline and Indian ambition, exposed him to a wider world. His teachers, some stern and others compassionate, could not help noticing that the young prince was different. He did not merely learn lessons, he questioned them. When British headmasters extolled the virtues of the empire, Mahendra listened, but within him, a voice whispered, "At what cost has this empire flourished?" He walked the gardens of the campus late into the evenings, his mind swirling with questions. He read of Rome and its fall, of the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille, of nations rising against oppressors. These were not just stories of distant lands, they were parables for his own enslaved country. Every word etched deeper into his soul, the belief that India, too, must rise. But education was not limited to books. In the evenings, Mahendra would often venture into the bazaars beyond the college gates. He watched artisans hammering iron, weavers working tirelessly at their looms, and small shopkeepers selling cloth, spices, or earthen pots. These were the people who sustained India's ancient dignity, yet they lived in poverty, crushed by British taxation and the flood of machine-made imports from Manchester. Mahendra's heart ached as he realized that freedom was not only about flags and borders, it was about dignity in the lives of these common men and women. By the time he was 16, he no longer looked at life through the polished lenses of royalty. He looked through the eyes of a dreamer and a rebel. The marriage and the awakening. In 1902, still a student, Mahendra was married to Balveer Kaur, a princess of Haryana's princely state. The ceremony was grand, as befitted their status, but within Mahendra there was restlessness. Marriage anchored him to duty, yet it did not quench the fire that was now raging. His new family, especially his father-in-law, wished for him to embrace the safe path of aristocracy. But Mahendra's heart was not swayed by silks or jewels. His eyes were fixed on a horizon far beyond palaces. The year 1905 brought with it an event that shook him to the core: the partition of Bengal. When Lord Curzon's decree sliced the land into two, dividing Hindus and Muslims under the pretense of administration, the nation erupted. Streets thundered with slogans of Swadeshi. Voices called for boycotts of foreign goods, and young men whispered about revolution in secret corners. For Mahendra, this was a revelation. Here was proof that the empire thrived not on unity, but on division. It was a deliberate policy to weaken India by pitting her own children against one another. The fire of the Swadeshi movement gripped him. He admired its call for self-reliance, for empowering India's own artisans and industries. It was not just politics, it was justice. He saw in it a way to restore pride to the very people he had watched struggling in Aligarh's bazaars. Against the advice of his elders, in 1906, he traveled to Calcutta to attend the Congress session. His family begged him to stay away, fearing his involvement would endanger their name. But Mahendra went. The journey to Calcutta was long, but his heart raced with anticipation. When he arrived, he stepped into a hall filled with the greatest minds and hearts of the age. He listened to fiery speeches, watched men and women rise with passion, and felt the pulse of a nation awakening. This was no ordinary political meeting. It was a sacred gathering, a call to arms of conscience. Here, Mahendra found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with men who would one day become legends. Though still young, he felt the weight of history pressing upon him. His life, he knew, would not belong to himself alone. The turning of the tide. The Congress session did not merely inspire him, it transformed him. He returned home with his blood burning, speaking endlessly about the need to support local artisans, to establish small industries, to boycott foreign goods. His words carried both conviction and urgency, but they unsettled his royal kin. "You are a prince," his relatives chided him. "Your duty is to your throne, not to politics." But Mahendra would not be silenced. "What is a throne?" he would reply. "If the people at its feet are broken?" The clash within his family deepened. His father-in-law, in particular, viewed his actions with suspicion. Aristocratic circles feared that Mahendra was treading a path that would bring ruin upon them. But Mahendra was unmoved. He was no longer the obedient prince. He was the restless rebel, ready to walk away from palaces if it meant standing with his people. Seeds of exile unknown to him then, the choices he was making would one day cast him into decades of exile. His association with radicals and reformers, his sympathy for revolution, his disdain for colonial rule, all these would mark him in the eyes of the British. But for Mahendra, none of this mattered. He believed that life was not measured by safety but by purpose. In these years, the vision of a free India crystallized in his mind. It was not a vague dream, but a living, breathing image. He saw farmers tilling their land without fear of tax collectors, artisans selling goods proudly stamped as Indian, children learning in schools free from colonial prejudice, and Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians standing shoulder to shoulder as brothers. This dream became his obsession. And so, while the world saw a young prince with a crown awaiting him, Mahendra saw himself as something far different, a soldier of freedom, bound to a destiny larger than himself. This was only the beginning. The true test of his resolve, the fire that would forge him into a revolutionary, still lay ahead. He would cross borders, defy empires, and walk into the very heart of world wars to raise the flag of an India yet unborn. The world had not yet realized it, but the rebel prince had already begun his march. Part 3. Into the Flames of Revolution. The year was 1915, and the world was already on fire. The cannons of the First World War thundered across Europe, monarchies trembled, and empires bled. For Mahendra Pratap, this was no ordinary war. It was a crack in the wall of British power, a chance for India to strike at her captors. By now, he had traveled widely across Europe, absorbing ideas, meeting radicals, and sharpening his vision. In the salons of Switzerland, in the drawing rooms of Berlin, he mingled with thinkers, revolutionaries, and politicians who saw in the war an opportunity to redraw the map of the world. He was no longer merely a prince, he was a man with a mission, to liberate India by any means possible. The call from Berlin. It was Virendranath Chattopadhyay, better known as Chatto, who first reached out. A fiery revolutionary and brother of the poet Sarojini Naidu, Chatto was part of the Berlin Committee, a gathering of Indian nationalists in Germany plotting to strike against the British. Chatto believed that Mahendra, with his royal lineage and burning patriotism, could be the face of their cause. He wrote urgently, asking him to come to Berlin and meet with the German High Command. Germany, locked in a mortal struggle with Britain, was eager to weaken its enemy by fueling rebellion in India. Mahendra knew the risks to ally with one imperial power against another was dangerous, yet he saw a sliver of hope. If Germany could aid India's freedom fighters, perhaps the chains of colonial rule could be shattered. And so, defying caution, he journeyed to Berlin. An audience with the Kaiser. When Mahendra entered the halls of power in Berlin, he carried not the demeanor of a supplicant, but of a leader. He demanded to meet Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor himself. At first, the idea seemed audacious, a young Indian prince asking to see the ruler of one of the world's greatest empires. Yet the tide of war made strange allies, and soon Mahendra stood face to face with the Kaiser. The meeting was electric. The Kaiser, dressed in his resplendent uniform, listened as Mahendra spoke with passion about India's plight. He described villages stripped of wealth, farmers driven to hunger, artisans ruined by British imports, and the endless humiliation of a nation enslaved. The Kaiser, sensing an opportunity, promised support. In recognition of his boldness, Mahendra was awarded the Order of the Red Eagle, one of Germany's highest honors. But the medal was not what he sought. What mattered was that the Kaiser understood the strategic value of India, that if India rose in rebellion, Britain's empire would tremble. The journey east, with German backing, Mahendra now embarked on a daring mission. Accompanied by Werner Otto von Hentig, a German diplomat, and joined by revolutionaries like Malavi Barkatullah, he set out toward Afghanistan, the key frontier. The plan was bold: persuade the Afghan king to join forces, open a front against the British through the northwest, and spark a general uprising in India. The journey itself was perilous. From Berlin they traveled to Vienna, where they met the Khedive of Egypt, who declared his own desire to see the British Empire fall. In Turkey, they were received by Enver Pasha, the Ottoman Minister of War and son-in-law of the Sultan. Enver promised them guidance and appointed officers to accompany them. Everywhere Mahendra went, he spoke not as a courtly prince but as a voice of India, urging leaders to see Britain's vulnerability and strike while the world was distracted by war. At Isfahan in Persia, they were greeted by Rauf Bey, who came with 2,000 soldiers to escort them. The caravan cut a dramatic figure, a prince, revolutionaries, and soldiers marching across mountains and deserts, carrying not just arms but the dream of a free India. Finally, after weeks of perilous travel, they reached Kabul on the 2nd of October 1915. Here, the next chapter of Mahendra's life and India's revolution was to unfold. The dream of a government in exile. In Kabul, Mahendra met King Habibullah Khan of Afghanistan. The discussions were tense. Habibullah admired Mahendra's courage, but hesitated to break openly with Britain. The king's court was divided. Some urged caution, fearing Britain's wrath, while others whispered of the glory of striking a blow for Islam and India alike. Yet, Mahendra did not falter. He pressed on with unshakable determination, and on the 1st of December 1915, his 30th birthday, a historic declaration was made: the formation of the Provisional Government of India in exile. The announcement sent ripples across the world. Here, in the heart of Kabul, a government was proclaimed to represent free India, standing in defiance of British rule. Mahendra Pratap was named president, Maulavi Barkatullah became prime minister, and Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi took charge as home minister. Together, they issued a call for jihad against British imperialism. It was a moment of immense symbolism. Though lacking territory or army, the provisional government was a bold declaration that India was not a passive colony, but a nation yearning for self-rule. For Mahendra, it was the fulfillment of years of restless dreaming to raise a flag of freedom, however fragile, in the name of his people. The shadows of betrayal. Yet even as he celebrated this triumph, Mahendra sensed the fragility of their position. The Afghan king, while sympathetic, wavered. Britain's diplomats worked tirelessly to keep Afghanistan neutral, offering promises and threats. The German and Turkish allies, though supportive, were stretched thin by the war. The revolution, for all its grandeur, hung by a thread. Still, Mahendra did not despair. For him, the act itself, declaring a government in exile, was a victory. It sent a message to India and to the world that her sons would never bow, that even in exile they would carry the torch of freedom. As he stood in Kabul, surrounded by allies and uncertain friends, Mahendra felt the weight of history upon him. He was no longer simply a prince or even a revolutionary. He was now the president of free India, a leader of a nation yet unborn. The path ahead would be fraught with betrayals, hardships, and exile. But on that December day in 1915, the rebel prince had carved his name into the annals of history. Part 4. Across Continents, into Revolutions. When the Provisional Government of India was proclaimed in Kabul, the air had vibrated with hope. But Mahendra Pratap knew that declarations alone could not break an empire. Britain's grip on India was iron, its armies vast, and its spies everywhere. To weaken such a power, he needed allies not just in Kabul or Berlin, but across the world. And so began the next chapter of his journey. A tireless odyssey through nations, courts, and revolutions, seeking the hand of friendship for India's freedom. The road to Russia. By 1917, the tide of war had shifted. In Europe, soldiers bled in trenches, and monarchies teetered on the edge of collapse. Russia itself was a volcano ready to erupt. For Mahendra, Russia offered both a danger and an opportunity. It was a land where the old order was crumbling, and new ideologies were taking root. Perhaps, he thought, India's cause might find an echo there. He traveled northward, through perilous routes, until at last he reached Leningrad. There he met none other than Leon Trotsky, the fiery revolutionary whose words could move masses. Trotsky was already plotting the overthrow of the Tsarist order and the birth of a new world. Mahendra spoke to him not merely as a petitioner but as a fellow dreamer of liberty. He told Trotsky of India's anguish of fields stripped bare by British taxes, of peasants starving while warehouses filled with grain for export, of artisans ruined by the flood of foreign goods. Trotsky listened intently, his piercing eyes betraying both curiosity and sympathy. India, he said, was a land whose awakening would one day shake the world. The two men, though from different continents and traditions, felt the kinship of rebels bound by a common enemy: imperialism. Meeting Lenin. From Leningrad, Mahendra journeyed deeper into the heart of revolutionary Russia. It was there that he met Vladimir Lenin, the man whose name would soon become synonymous with revolution itself. The meeting was brief but unforgettable. Lenin, sharp and intense, asked precise questions about India's political state, the strength of its movements, and the will of its people. Mahendra spoke with fervor of the Congress, of revolutionaries scattered across continents, of peasants and workers yearning for freedom. Lenin, pragmatic as ever, saw in India not just a colony in chains, but a potential partner in the global struggle against imperialism. Though resources were scarce and Russia itself was in chaos, the conversation planted seeds. Mahendra left with the sense that he had found a comrade in spirit, if not yet in arms. The German connection. But Russia was only one stop. Mahendra returned to Germany, carrying with him messages and reports. The Kaiser and his ministers still hoped to use India's unrest as a weapon against Britain. They arranged for Mahendra to travel by German aeroplane, whisking him across borders to carry out secret missions. For a prince once destined for the quiet dignity of palaces, the experience was surreal to be flown over hostile skies in wartime, bearing letters, proposals, and dreams of rebellion. He traveled also to Budapest and Switzerland, speaking with exiled revolutionaries and sympathetic officials. Everywhere he went, he wove the same plea. India's freedom was not just a national question, but a global cause. An enslaved India was the backbone of Britain's empire. A free India would change the world. The Afghan king's reluctance. But even as he ranged across continents, the heart of the matter remained in Afghanistan. King Habibullah Khan, despite his cordial meetings, hesitated to take decisive steps. Britain had dangled promises before him: recognition, support, and the preservation of his throne. To openly ally with Germany and Turkey against Britain was a risk he was unwilling to take. Mahendra understood the king's caution, but could not hide his frustration. He had staked everything on this plan: an Indo-Afghan front that would unleash rebellion in India's north. But the king's delays stretched on, and slowly, the dream began to unravel. A mission without borders. Still, Mahendra did not give up. When King Amanullah succeeded Habibullah, he sent Mahendra on a wider mission to China, Tibet, Japan, Siam, Turkey, Germany, and even the United States. Mahendra accepted with vigor. If one door closed, another must open. In China, he saw the stirrings of a nation torn between warlords and reformers, yearning to modernize. In Tibet, he glimpsed the deep spirituality of a people fiercely protective of their autonomy. In Japan, he found perhaps his greatest hope: a rising Asian power, proud and independent, that might one day lead the East against Western domination. He spoke tirelessly, meeting ministers, intellectuals, and exiles. His message never wavered. India's struggle was not just India's, but Asia's and indeed the world's. If India could break her chains, the entire colonial system would tremble. The Nobel nomination. It was during this period of ceaseless wandering that an unexpected recognition came. In 1932, a Swedish activist, N.A.W.W. Nilsson, nominated Mahendra Pratap for the Nobel Peace Prize. Nilsson admired him not only as a revolutionary but as a visionary who dreamed of a world federation, a global union where nations would resolve disputes through dialogue, not war. The nomination highlighted Mahendra's extraordinary journey. He was described as the unofficial envoy of Afghanistan, as the president of the Provisional Government of India, as a tireless traveler who had met kaisers, sultans, kings, and revolutionaries. He was praised not only for his political work but for his vision of global peace, a man who saw beyond borders, dreaming of a humanity united. Though he did not win the prize, the nomination itself was a testament to his stature. From the deserts of Kabul to the boulevards of Europe, his name was known. He was no longer just the rebel prince of Mersin, he was a figure of international consequence. The lonely path. Yet for all his recognition, Mahendra often walked a lonely road. His missions were costly, his successes fragile, his allies fickle. The British hunted him across continents, branding him a traitor and a conspirator. Home was denied to him, exile became his companion, but he bore it all with quiet strength. To him, sacrifice was not suffering, it was duty. He would wander the world as long as it took, speaking for his voiceless countrymen, planting seeds in foreign soil, waiting for the day when India would rise. And though the provisional government in Kabul faded into history, its spirit endured. It was proof that India's freedom movement was not confined to her borders. It was global, relentless, unstoppable. Mahendra Pratap, soldier of dreams, carried that torch across deserts, through revolutions, over skies scarred by war, always moving, always speaking, always fighting for a freedom he might never live to see. Part 5. The Rising Sun and the Second War. By the time the world staggered toward the 1,940 seconds, Mahendra Pratap was no longer the fiery youth who had first raised the flag of India in exile at Kabul. He was older now, his beard streaked with gray, his eyes bearing the fatigue of decades of wandering. Yet his spirit unbroken, unbent, remained aflame. A second Great War had erupted. Europe once more became a battlefield. But now the flames reached even further into Asia, into the Pacific, into every corner of the world. For Mahendra, this was not just another clash of empires. It was another opening, another crack in Britain's armor. And in this moment, he turned his gaze toward Japan. Japan, the hope of Asia. Japan had risen like a comet in the east. In just a few decades, it had transformed from a feudal society into a modern power, shocking the world by defeating Russia in 1905. To Mahendra, Japan symbolized what Asia could be: independent, powerful, standing tall against the West. If Japan could achieve such strength, why not India? In the early 1,940 seconds, Mahendra made his way to Tokyo. The city hummed with wartime fervor, banners flying, soldiers marching, leaders speaking of a new Asia free from Western dominance. For many Asian revolutionaries, Japan was the beacon, a partner that might help them overthrow colonial masters. Here, Mahendra established the Executive Board of India in 1940. Its purpose was bold: to rally support, to coordinate Indian revolutionaries, and to prepare the way for independence. For Mahendra, Japan was not merely an ally of convenience. He believed that a strong Asian brotherhood could be forged, one where India, China, Japan, and others would stand united, between allies and empires. But Mahendra was no fool. He saw Japan's ambitions clearly. Its armies marched into China. Its empire expanded aggressively. Many whispered that Japan's dream of Asia for Asians masked another imperial hunger. Yet Mahendra, ever pragmatic, believed that even imperfect alliances could serve India's cause. He walked a tightrope, navigating Japanese politics, meeting leaders, urging them to see India not as a pawn, but as a partner. He reminded them that India was the jewel Britain could not afford to lose. If India rose, Britain's empire would shatter. In the midst of this, he never stopped writing, never stopped speaking. His pen remained as sharp as his sword. Through articles, speeches, and appeals, he continued to tell the world of India's suffering and of her unyielding will to be free. A world in chaos. As the Second World War deepened, Mahendra watched as nations crumbled. France fell. Germany stormed across Europe. Japan struck Pearl Harbor, pulling the United States into the war. The map of the world seemed to twist and shatter with each passing year. In India itself, the freedom movement surged once again. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in 1942, calling for the British to leave at once. Across the land, protests, strikes, and uprisings shook the Raj. In those moments, Mahendra felt both pride and sorrow. Pride, because his beloved homeland was rising. Sorrow, because he could not be there in her hour of need. He was still a man in exile, a wanderer who had given up home and comfort for a dream. 30 years had passed since he had last walked the soil of India. His family, his childhood palaces, his land all remained distant, unreachable. The long years of exile. Exile is a strange companion. It robs one of the warmth of home, yet it steals the heart with purpose. For Mahendra, exile was not merely physical separation, it was sacrifice. He often said that his life was not his own, that he had been given to the cause of freedom. But even he, in his quiet hours, must have felt the weight of loneliness. Friends and comrades came and went, allies betrayed, nations changed their policies. Yet through it all, Mahendra remained steady. His loyalty was not to governments or kings, but to a vision, a free India. The war's end. In 1945, the war ended in fire and devastation. Germany lay in ruins. Japan, the land where Mahendra had placed so much hope, was bombed into surrender. The United States emerged triumphant, the new master of global power. Britain, though victorious, was exhausted, its empire shaken to the core. For Mahendra, the end of the war brought both disappointment and possibility. Japan, his last great hope for immediate support, had fallen. But Britain, weakened and weary, could no longer hold India forever. The winds of change were undeniable. And so, as the world rebuilt itself, Mahendra prepared for the next chapter of his journey, the long-awaited return to his homeland. The return approaches. After 32 years of exile, the chance finally came. In 1946, as negotiations for India's independence accelerated, the British permitted his return. For Mahendra, it was like stepping out of a long night into dawn. On the ship City of Paris, he sailed back toward the land he had not seen for decades. Each wave that carried him closer to India carried also memories of all he had endured: the provisional government in Kabul, the flights across Europe, the meetings with Trotsky and Lenin, the boardrooms of Tokyo, the endless exile. And when at last, on the 9th of August, 1946, he set foot in Madras, the soil beneath his feet seemed to tremble with welcome. The rebel prince had come home. Part 6. Homecoming to a Changing Land. The date was the 9th of August, 1946. The ship City of Paris anchored at Madras, and down its gangway stepped a man who had been absent from India for 32 long years. His beard was full, his face weathered by decades of struggle, but his eyes still burned with the fire of youth. This was Raja Mahendra Pratap, returning at last to the soil for which he had sacrificed everything. The streets did not resound with fanfare. There were no processions waiting, no garlands of flowers strewn in his path. For India was in turmoil, negotiations with the British had reached a fever pitch, and communal tensions brewed ominously. Yet for Mahendra, none of this dulled the ecstasy of the moment. Every breath of Indian air filled him with gratitude. Every sight, the palm trees swaying, the cries of street vendors, the temple bells ringing in the distance, was a homecoming sweeter than any royal welcome. He bent down, touched the ground, and pressed the dust of India to his forehead. "I am yours again," he whispered, "after all these years." Meeting the Mahatma, his first journey was to Wardha, where he sought the man who had become the moral compass of India's struggle, Mahatma Gandhi. The meeting was symbolic, almost poetic. Gandhi, the advocate of nonviolence, and Mahendra, the globe-trotting revolutionary who had raised armies in exile, represented two different paths to the same goal. Yet, when they met, it was not as adversaries, but as brothers bound by a shared destiny. Gandhi welcomed him warmly. "You have given your life to India," he said. Mahendra bowed humbly, replying, "Bapu, I have done only my duty. My life has been a small offering compared to the suffering of our people." They spoke at length. Gandhi asked about his years abroad, his dealings with Germany, Turkey, Russia, and Japan. Mahendra explained that while methods might differ, the yearning for freedom was the same. "A people cannot breathe under chains," he said, "whether they resist with silence or with the sword. The spirit of resistance is one. Though their strategies had been different, their hearts aligned. Both men dreamed of an India free, sovereign, and just, the land he left behind." But as Mahendra traveled across India, he realized he had returned to a nation very different from the one he had left in 1914. Then, India had been a subdued colony, her people struggling to awaken. Now, the air crackled with determination. Freedom was no longer a distant dream, it was imminent. The Congress and the Muslim League wrestled over the shape of the future, while millions of common Indians raised their voices for independence. Yet, amid this rising hope, Mahendra also sensed darkness. Communal tensions simmered, threatening to tear apart the fragile unity he had always envisioned. Where he had once dreamed of Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians standing as brothers, he now heard rumors of partition, of division, of blood. It pained him deeply. For decades, he had wandered the world, telling leaders that India was one of vast, diverse, yet united land. And now, as freedom drew near, that unity seemed to be fraying. Reception among leaders. Among India's political elite, his return drew mixed reactions. Some welcomed him as a hero, a man who had risked everything for freedom. Others, especially those aligned with the British or skeptical of his foreign dealings, treated him with suspicion. To many young Indians, however, he was an inspiration. They crowded around him, eager to hear his stories of meetings with the Kaiser, of flying in German planes, of sitting with Lenin, of setting up a government in Kabul. His tales were not just history. They were living proof that India's freedom struggle was global, that her sons had carried her cause across oceans and continents. An emotional pilgrimage. For Mahendra, his return was not merely political, it was profoundly personal. He traveled to Mursan, the land of his birth, walking through palaces now half forgotten, touching the walls of halls where he had once played as a child. Time had weathered them, as it had weathered him. He visited schools, speaking to children. "Do not think of yourselves as weak," he told them. "You are heirs to a land that has given wisdom to the world. But you must work with your hands, with your minds, with your hearts. India will be what you make her." Everywhere he went, he carried the same message. Freedom was not the end, but the beginning. The chains of Britain might soon be broken, but the greater task to build a just, equal, and strong India still lay ahead. Shadows on the horizon. As 1947 approached, the inevitability of partition became clearer. Mahendra, who had always dreamed of a united India standing tall in the family of nations, felt anguish. He spoke passionately against division, warning that communal hatred would weaken the very freedom they had all fought for. But history was merciless. The lines were drawn, the land was split, and rivers of blood flowed between Hindu and Muslim. Mahendra, like so many patriots, was forced to watch helplessly as the unity he had preached gave way to violence. Yet even in this sorrow, he did not despair. "India will heal," he said. Her wounds are deep, but her spirit is deeper still. Freedom, though born in pain, will endure. A rebel among free men. In independent India, Mahendra was a curious figure. He was revered for his sacrifice, yet he did not belong fully to any political camp. He was too radical for some, too independent for others. But he did not care. He had never fought for office or reward. His only desire was to serve. And so he walked among the people, speaking, writing, urging them to rise above division and to embrace the task of nation-building. He warned against blind imitation of the West, calling instead for self-reliance, for respect of India's traditions, for education that built both mind and soul. His return had come at the twilight of empire, but for him, it was not an ending. It was the dawn of a new struggle, not against Britain now, but against poverty, injustice, and ignorance. The rebel prince had returned home, not to rest, but to fight on. Part 7. The Rebel in Parliament. By the 1952nd, India was free. The British had departed. The tricolor flew proudly, and the Constitution had given the new republic its voice. For many freedom fighters, this was a moment to retire, to rest after decades of struggle. But for Raja Mahendra Pratap, rest was unthinkable. He had not returned from exile to watch quietly from the sidelines. His soul, restless as ever, demanded he play a part in shaping the destiny of the nation he had fought so hard to free. And so, in 1957, he stepped into the democratic arena, the Lok Sabha elections. The contest in Mathura. His battleground was Mathura, a land of sacred temples and deep history, but also a land of poverty and struggle. Mahendra, though now in his 70s, walked its villages tirelessly. The peasants knew his name not from posters or propaganda, but from the whispers of history. "This is the man," they said, "who went abroad, who raised our flag in Kabul, who lived for freedom while we toiled in chains." His opponent was no ordinary man either. Among the candidates stood Atal Bihari Vajpayee, young, eloquent, and ambitious, representing the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, the party that would, in time, evolve into the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP. Vajpayee was destined for greatness. The world did not yet know it, but he would one day be prime minister. Yet in 1957, he was still rising, still untested. The contest was electric, the fiery youth against the seasoned revolutionary. Crowds gathered, debates flared, slogans echoed across the fields. When the results were declared, history tilted in Mahendra's favor. He had won as an independent candidate, defeating his rivals, with Vajpayee trailing in a humble 4th place. For the rebel prince, it was another vindication. Though he had spent decades in exile, though he had no party machinery behind him, the people still trusted his name, his sacrifice, his unbending spirit. A voice in the Lok Sabha. The Parliament of India in those years was a sacred experiment, a new democracy finding its footing. Mahendra entered not as a career politician, but as a man with nothing to lose and everything to say. In the Lok Sabha, he spoke with the same bluntness that had marked his life. He did not flatter power, nor did he fear unpopularity. He rose to defend those whom others ignored, to demand recognition for revolutionaries whose sacrifices were being forgotten. On 22 November 1957, he moved a bill that shook the House. He called upon the nation to honor figures like Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, Birendra Kumar Ghosh, and Bhupendranath Datta, men who had once taken up arms, who had suffered prison and exile for India's freedom. Mahendra believed their contributions could not be erased, however controversial their methods might have been. The debate was fierce. Some members supported him, but many opposed, wary of reopening old wounds or appearing to endorse radicalism. In the final vote, his motion was defeated 48 inches favor, 75 against. Mahendra, true to his nature, did not bow his head in silence. Along with others, he walked out of the house in protest. His parting words echoed in the chamber. "I hope every Bengali and every Maratha will also walk out." It was a moment of defiance, a reminder that for him, politics was not about compromise, but about conscience. The outsider among politicians. In Parliament, Mahendra was always something of an outsider. He belonged to no party, served no ideology, and sought no personal gain. He was, in many ways, too honest, too uncompromising for the shifting sands of democratic politics. Yet his presence mattered. To younger members, he was a living link to the days of sacrifice, to the exiled government in Kabul, to the struggles in Berlin, Russia, and Japan. He reminded them that freedom was not a gift of diplomacy, but the fruit of unyielding courage. The weight of years. By the 1,960 seconds, age weighed heavily on him. His hair was white, his steps slower, yet his voice never lost its clarity. He continued to write, to travel, to speak to students, peasants, and workers. He warned of the dangers of corruption, of blind imitation of the West, of neglecting the poor. He urged self-reliance, echoing the Swadeshi ideals that had first lit his spirit half a century earlier. He was not always celebrated. In fact, often he was forgotten in the public glare that surrounded bigger political figures. But Mahendra did not crave applause. He had never lived for it. He had lived only for truth. The rebel in democracy. In many ways, his years in Parliament symbolized his entire life. A man out of step with the mainstream, unwilling to bend, unwilling to rest, always carrying the stubborn flame of conviction. He had been a prince who abandoned comfort, an exile who embraced hardship, a revolutionary who crossed continents, and now a parliamentarian who refused to flatter power. He remained, always, the rebel prince unchanged, unyielding, unforgettable. And as his life entered its twilight, the question that lingered was not what office he held or what bills he passed, but what legacy he would leave. For legacies are not written in votes or speeches. They are written in the fire of a man's soul, in the courage of his choices, in the dream he leaves behind. Mahendra Pratap's legacy was still being written. Part 8. The Dream Beyond Nations. As the years wore on and India settled into the rhythms of independence, Raja Mahendra Pratap found himself less in the glare of public life and more in the quiet reflection of philosophy. The man who had once conspired in Berlin, marched across Persia, and declared a government in Kabul now devoted his twilight years to ideas vast enough to embrace not just India, but the world itself. The vision of a world federation, long before the United Nations took shape, long before the phrase global governance entered political vocabulary, Mahendra had dreamed of something extraordinary, a world federation. In his imagination, humanity was not divided by borders, flags, or armies, but united under a common council of nations. Wars would end, disputes would be settled through dialogue, and resources would be shared so that no nation suffered in hunger while another drowned in plenty. It was this dream that had even earned him a Nobel Peace Prize nomination in 1932. His nominator, N.A. Nilsson of Sweden, admired him not only as a revolutionary but as a prophet of global unity. While others saw him as a rebel prince, Nilsson saw him as a philosopher king who spoke not just of India's freedom but of humanity's emancipation from violence and greed. For Mahendra, the idea was simple, yet profound. If the world can be ruled by empires, why not by brotherhood? The advocate of peace. The irony of his life was striking. Here was a man who had once courted Germany and Turkey, who had walked into revolutions and spoken of jihad against Britain, now speaking as a messenger of peace. But in truth, there was no contradiction. His wars had always been wars of liberation, not conquest. His rebellion had always been rooted in justice, not ambition. Now, free from the burden of struggle, he turned his words toward peace. He wrote essays, gave lectures, and urged leaders to think beyond narrow nationalism. He reminded them that the world had already endured 2 catastrophic wars in one lifetime. How many more would humanity survive? He traveled to universities, to small gatherings, to halls where young students sat wide-eyed as he spoke. "Do not think of yourselves only as Indians," he would say. "Think of yourselves as citizens of the world. The divisions we inherit are accidents of history. The unity we must build is the destiny of mankind." The teacher's heart. More than politics, more than speeches, Mahendra found joy in education. He believed the real revolution would not come through armies but through schools. A child taught to think freely, to work with dignity, to embrace truth. That child was the true foundation of independence. He spent much of his later life establishing and supporting institutions of learning. For him, every classroom was a battlefield where ignorance was the enemy, and every teacher was a soldier of light. He urged curricula to blend modern science with spiritual wisdom, industrial training with moral grounding. He warned against blind westernization, calling instead for an education rooted in India's own genius, yet open to the best of the world. In this, he revealed himself not just as a rebel but as a reformer, not just a fighter but a father figure for generations to come. The philosopher in exile no more. Even as he grew frail, Mahendra never lost the clarity of his thought. He wrote constantly, his words carrying the same force as his speeches of youth. He spoke of brotherhood, of social justice, of the duty of the rich toward the poor. He urged young Indians not to chase power or wealth but to serve. Though he had returned from exile long ago, a part of him remained forever. The wanderer, the man who had crossed frontiers, not for conquest but for connection. He had walked the palaces of Berlin, the streets of Leningrad, the temples of Japan, the halls of Washington, and everywhere he had carried one message: humanity must rise above division. A life of sacrifice. By the 1,970 seconds, he was in his 90s. Few men live to such an age, and fewer still live every year with such intensity. Yet even in those last years, Mahendra was restless. He could have rested in his princely estate, enjoyed reverence as a veteran freedom fighter, but he chose otherwise. He remained simple, accessible, humble. He dressed plainly, lived modestly, and gave freely of his time to anyone who sought his counsel. He often said, "I have no regrets. I left my palace, my comforts, my youth for India. What greater fortune could a man ask for than to give his life for his people?" The closing chapter. On the 29th of April, 1979, at the age of 92, the rebel prince breathed his last. The news did not dominate the headlines. India had moved on. The world had moved on. Yet for those who remembered, his passing was the end of an era. He had lived through the British Raj, through 2 world wars, through exile and return, through the birth of independence. He had dined with emperors, debated with revolutionaries, walked among peasants, and taught children. His life was a bridge between worlds, between royalty and rebellion, between war and peace, between India and the world. As he was laid to rest, those who stood by his side knew they were saying farewell not just to a man, but to a vision of a world freer, kinder, nobler than the one we know. His legacy today, Raja Mahendra Pratap, is not a household name. His memory lingers in history books, in a few schools and institutions that bear his name, in the whispers of old revolutionaries who once knew him. Yet his legacy is immense. He proved that freedom was not the work of a few leaders alone, but of countless men and women, each carrying the flame in their own way. And above all, he proved that even a prince, born to luxury, could renounce it all and live, suffer, wander, and die as nothing more and nothing less than a servant of freedom. Part 9. The Rebel Prince Lives On. When the long arc of his life is traced from the gilded palaces of Mersin to the barren deserts of Kabul, from the lecture halls of Aligarh to the battlefronts of world wars, from exile in foreign lands to the benches of parliament, one cannot help but feel that Raja Mahendra Pratap's story was never simply his own. It was, in truth, the story of a nation in chains, of a people searching for their soul, of an idea that refused to die. The paradox of a prince born into privilege. He could have lived as a comfortable noble, enjoying titles, wealth, and ease. But fate and conscience pulled him in another direction. He shed silks for khadi, palaces for foreign streets, luxury for hardship. He became what few princes dared to be, a revolutionary. His life was a paradox, a man of war who dreamed of peace, a prince who chose poverty, a wanderer who found his home in service. He was a man who dined with emperors but broke bread with peasants, who could command respect in European courts, yet sit humbly before Gandhi in Warda, the forgotten hero. And yet, history has been unkind. His name does not thunder in every classroom like Gandhi or Nehru. His face does not appear on banknotes. His deeds are not celebrated with pomp on Independence Day. He remains, to many, a footnote, a rebel prince, a curious figure remembered only in fragments, but perhaps that is fitting. For Mahendra never sought glory. He sought freedom. He never desired monuments. His monument was the living, breathing fact of India, itself free, sovereign, and alive. A life of sacrifice remembered. Even in his final years, he reminded the young that freedom was not an end, but a beginning. "Do not think," he said, "that independence is the final victory. It is only the first step. You must build an India worthy of her people, just strong, united. Otherwise, the chains will return in another form." These words ring true even today. His warnings about division, corruption, blind imitation of the West, and neglect of the poor echo across the decades. His dream of education as the foundation of the nation remains as urgent now as it was then. His vision of a world federation, once dismissed as utopian, seems prophetic in a world still scarred by conflict. The eternal wanderer. In a way, Mahendra never truly came home. Yes, he returned to India in 1946, but the restlessness of exile never left him. He was always wandering, if not across borders, then across ideas. His mind leapt from India's villages to the world's parliaments, from the spinning wheel to the stars. He lived with one foot in the soil of his people and the other in the dream of humanity. And so, even in death, he belongs not only to India, but to the world. The Rebel Flame. On the 29th of April, 1979, the flame of his body was extinguished, but the flame of his spirit did not die. It lives in the schools that bear his name, in the speeches of students who read his life, in the quiet pride of those who know that freedom was bought not by a few, but by many, and he was among the greatest of them. For what is a hero, if not one who gives everything and expects nothing? His meaning today. In a time when the world is once again divided, when nations quarrel and humanity stumbles, Mahendra's vision whispers to us, borders are not destiny. Brotherhood is. War is not inevitable. Peace is possible. But only if we dare to dream, as I once dreamed, of a world where no man is master and no nation a slave. He was, above all, a dreamer. A dreamer who dared to live his dream. And so, when we remember him, let us not remember only the medals, the titles, the dates of his battles. Let us remember the restless heart of a man who could not bear to see his people bowed. Let us remember the courage of a prince who chose to walk barefoot with the poor. Let us remember the voice that cried in halls across continents, "India shall be free." The final image. Picture him, then, not as an old man in his 90s, but as the young prince who stood in Kabul on the 1st of December 1915, raising the banner of a government that existed only in hope. His eyes burn, his voice carries, and behind him stretches the dream of millions yet unborn. That dream did not die. It took 32 years, oceans of sacrifice, rivers of blood, but it came true. And today, every time the Indian flag flutters in the wind, it flutters also for him. For Raja Mahendra Pratap, the rebel prince, the exile, the visionary, the eternal servant of freedom.